That evening in Washington, it was still light when Kofi Amadou, Senator of the Republic, returned home after a long day in the Senate. At 56, he had gone through years of struggles, victories, and defeats. A former defense attorney, he had become a respected leader in political circles and within the black community, a tireless defender of civil rights. His face was now familiar on television, his speeches applauded by those fighting for equality, inclusion, and justice reform. That day, he presided over a crucial session on criminal justice reform, advocating reduced sentences for nonviolent offenders, an end to mass incarceration, and increased investment in education and social services in black neighborhoods. Over the years, he had become an iconic figure for marginalized communities. He was not just a politician, but a symbol of hope for those who fought against systemic racism and social injustice every day. However, beyond the plaudits and honors, Kofi remained a man with his own inner struggles. He knew that despite his successes, his appearance, his name, and the color of his skin remained elements that often defined him in the eyes of others, beyond his status or his accomplishments. That evening, as he drove quietly in his black sedan, he thought about his family, his children, the meeting he had just left, and the busy weeks ahead. He had recently purchased this car, a luxury sedan, a symbol of personal accomplishment after so many years of hard work and sacrifice. It was a thoughtful purchase, intended to reward his years of work serving his community, not a sign of vanity. His car, as luxurious as it was a means of transportation, and he did not expect any special treatment from it. He felt calm as he returned home, thinking about the quiet evening that awaited him. The neighborhood he was passing through was not his. It was in an upscale part of town, a place where the majority of residents were white and somewhat conservative. Kofi had never had any particular problem in this neighborhood, because he came there regularly for political meetings or meetings with donors. However, he knew that this environment was not necessarily favorable to those who, like him, came from a modest background and bore the stigma of race. He was driving slowly, his car sliding on the asphalt, when something caught his attention. A flash of light in the rearview mirror. Headlights shining unnaturally, approaching with disturbing speed. He felt a shiver of unease pass through him. The headlights grew more and more urgent, as if they were trying to capture him in their glare. He instinctively slows down. The police car, an ordinary but imposing sedan, was approaching dangerously close to him. For no apparent reason, he felt on edge. It wasn't the first time a police officer had followed him closely, but that evening there was something strange in the air. He quietly turned at the next intersection, hoping the vehicle would continue on its way. But no. The police car's sirens suddenly turned on, and a flashing light flooded the scene. He suddenly felt vulnerable, not because of any wrongdoing he had committed, but because of the simple reality of who he was. Kofi knew that in some corners of this country, he was seen not as a respected senator or an accomplished lawyer, but as a threat, a man to watch. He stopped his car, got out calmly, and waited. He knew how things were going. A well-established routine. If he was arrested, he had to cooperate. But at that moment, he was still unaware that the reason for this stop was in fact not linked to any wrongdoing on his part. No, it was much more sinister than that. It was because of the color of his skin. The police officer who approached him was not an old hand, but a young agent, in his 30s, named Vincent Howard. There was nothing particular about his appearance that betrayed any particular animosity. Yet in his attitude there was a palpable coldness, as if he was preparing to treat the senator as a mere suspect. "Good evening, sir. May I see your papers?" Howard asked sharply, without looking at Kofi's badge, without even acknowledging his official position. Kofi froze for a moment, surprised by the lack of courtesy. But he was used to this. Once again, the color of his skin had betrayed him before he even opened his mouth. He remembered his own discussions with other political figures about the daily racism he experienced. A senator or a lawyer was not immune to racial stereotypes, especially when he found himself in an area unfamiliar to the authorities. "Of course, but could you tell me why you're arresting me?" "I'm a senator of the Republic, and I just came back from an important meeting," he replied calmly, his measured tone hiding the frustration that was building within him. The implacable police officer simply replied, "You've been arrested for speeding. I'm going to need your papers." Kofi felt a shock. He knew he hadn't exceeded the speed limit. His mind began to think faster, searching for a rational explanation. Maybe it was a mistake, a mix-up with another car? But the agent seemed so assured, so determined in his accusation. "Speed. I didn't exceed the limit," he replied calmly, while taking out his driver's license and registration certificate. "I advise you to check the traffic cameras in this area." "I told you not to argue, sir," Howard replied in a colder tone, his voice hardening slightly. "Stay in your car." Senator Kofi Amadou remains frozen in the situation unfolding before him. Agent Howard's every movement seems a denial of his humanity, a psychological violence far deeper than simple physical coercion. The weight of discrimination, which weighs heavily on the shoulders of many members of his community, cannot be reduced to a single action. He is not just a senator, a lawyer, or a civil rights activist. He is also a man who, although having fought all his life for equality, is now caught in a trap he thought he had escaped. This sense of déjà vu is almost overwhelming, as he knows that racial violence is pervasive, although invisible to some. The seconds that pass as he faces Agent Howard are fraught with built-up tension. Kofi recalls thousands of images of black men and women, caught in similar situations, forced to submit to the authority of a biased system. The humiliation he feels is not limited only to this arrest. It is a stark reminder of the place he occupies in a country that continues to ignore the dignity of some of its citizens. And it is even more bitter when he realizes that, despite his social position, his status as an elected official and his experience as a defender of rights, he is still perceived as a suspect. He could have reacted, shouted, defended himself with all the energy he had within him. But he knows the consequences of escalation all too well. He fights against this system every day, and he knows that any sudden movement could transform this illegal arrest into uncontrollable violence. Agent Howard, blinded by his prejudices, seems to ignore everything Kofi represents. In his mind, he does not see a man of honor, but a dark figure, potentially guilty, to be brought under control. "I'm not going to tell you to get out of the vehicle again, sir," Howard said, each word sounding like a threat. The agent's dry tone, the absence of any form of politeness, aggravates Kofi's humiliation. What could have been a simple routine check becomes a personal affront. But, despite the anger boiling inside him, Kofi remains motionless. He knows that the outcome of this confrontation will depend on his ability not to give in to the temptation to respond with violence. He remembers the faces of his children, the faces of his community, the faces of all those who suffered from police brutality. They count on him to stay calm, to be the one to break this cycle of violence and humiliation. When the agent suddenly opens the door and tries to force him out of the vehicle, Kofi feels like prey who want to strip his dignity. He is a man of order and law, yet what is unfolding before him is an obvious transgression of the constitutional order. "I'm going to have to handcuff you, sir," the officer announces, as if that will end this scene. Kofi, always calm, knows that this sentence is not simply an attempt by the agent to further humiliate him, but a symbol of a larger reality. The brutality and injustice that befell him are not an accident. They are rooted in centuries of systemic racism and institutional oppression. The agent does not recognize it as a legitimate authority. He reduces it to a simple object of questioning. But even under handcuffs, Kofi strives to maintain his dignity. He knows that no matter the humiliations he endures, history will one day remember him as a defender of rights, a man who faced injustice and refused to bend. "You don't have to do that. It's an illegal arrest," he said calmly. His words are chosen carefully. Kofi is not trying to provoke the agent, but rather to make his voice heard. His arms are now forced behind his back, but he feels his will remains intact. The humiliation is there, undeniable. Each gesture of the agent, each pressure exerted on his wrists, revives the painful memories of those who suffered before him. But in this precise moment, Kofi also feels a growing strength within him. He realizes that this moment can be a spark for greater change. His dignity and resistance are not only an act of defiance against Agent Howard, but a powerful symbol for all voices crushed by injustice. Officer Howard forces him to the ground without regard for his rights, for his dignity, for the man he is. But even in this humiliated position, Kofi refuses to be silenced. His eyes don't leave the agents. He doesn't give in. He knows that, despite the brutality of the moment, he carries within him a force greater than anything the agent could impose. He retains his dignity. He will always defend his values. The arrest of Kofi Amadou quickly took an explosive media turn. As Agent Howard continues to treat the senator in a humiliating manner, witnesses present begin filming the scene, their cameras ready to capture every detail of the incident. Within minutes, the video was shared on social media, where it went viral. Millions of people watch in disbelief as a respected politician, a renowned senator and lawyer, is attacked by police violence, not as a suspect, but as a citizen victim of ignorance and systemic racism. The hashtags "Justice for Kofi" and "Racism in the Police" are quickly taking over Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. It's not just a video of an arrest. It's the reflection of an entire system of oppression that is exploding into broad daylight. Black communities, already accustomed to police brutality, band together to support Kofi. Civil rights activists, community organizations, influencers and thought leaders are immediately coming forward, demanding justice. The video becomes a rallying cry, a symbol of hope for those fighting against injustice. Across the United States and beyond, protests are erupting, demanding accountability for the illegal arrest and police brutality inflicted on Kofi. A movement is forming under the name Justice for Kofi, a unified platform to denounce racism in law enforcement and demand profound reforms. At the police station, Kofi remains stoic despite the humiliation, knowing that his actions, even while imprisoned, will have repercussions. When he finally has the opportunity to send a message to his colleagues in the Senate, he makes sure to remind them of the nature of the incident, but also of the broader context in which it takes place. He doesn't just explain his own situation. He recalls that this police violence is a systemic problem that affects millions of people, particularly in Black communities. Soon after, the news went around the country. Kofi, accustomed to managing the media, this time finds himself at the center of national attention, far beyond what he would have imagined. Television cameras, newspaper articles, and radio broadcasts seized on the subject with fervor, making the incident a veritable catalyst for public conversation. The President of the Republic, shocked by the brutality of the arrest, made an official statement. In a solemn speech, he expressed his solidarity with Kofi Amadou and stressed that the incident was unacceptable. He calls for a rapid investigation and promises action to remedy this injustice. This statement by the President, although received with skepticism by some, increases the pressure on police authorities and judicial institutions. However, Officer Howard, for his part, strongly denies any racist act, categorically rejecting any accusation of discrimination. His superiors, although forced to conduct an internal investigation, seem more concerned about the image of the police than the deeper implications of the incident. But this affair becomes a turning point in Kofi's career. As voices of support are heard from all sides, he becomes aware of the cracks that exist in the political structure around him. Some of his colleagues, although displaying official solidarity, are beginning to show hesitation. For them, the incident is above all a question of electoral strategy. Kofi quickly perceives that, behind the smiles and the speeches of support, some are more concerned by the political implications of the affair than by the real issue: justice and equality. In addition, some members of his entourage advise him not to directly attack the police, for fear that this would create too great a division within his party's electoral base. The temptation for pragmatic politics is strong, but Kofi refuses to be caught in the trap of opportunism. He chooses not to let the pressure get him down. Instead, he is taking this opportunity to launch an ambitious and necessary reform. National police reform aimed at instituting extensive racial bias training, strengthening law enforcement accountability, and providing legislative support to vulnerable communities, particularly African Americans, who have long been victims of police violence. Kofi transforms his experience into a platform for change, rejecting political compromise in favor of a more just and equitable vision for all. It calls for concrete measures, independent investigations into every case of police brutality, increased funding for restorative justice initiatives, and reform of the penal system to reduce systemic discrimination. Meanwhile, Agent Howard finds himself under internal investigation, facing accusations of racial discrimination and abuse of power. But the case goes well beyond this single police officer. It becomes the starting point for a national awareness of systemic racism and police brutality. More and more voices are being raised, denouncing a racist institutional culture within the police, calling for in-depth reform. Protests and rallies are increasing, giving a voice to those who have long been silenced. Kofi Amadou emerges from this ordeal stronger than ever, and his name becomes synonymous with resistance. He is determined to use his experience to take the fight for equality to an even higher level. What he endured becomes an opportunity to advance social justice, through legislative reforms and unprecedented citizen mobilization. The arrest served as a catalyst, a triggering moment for changes that he says are urgent and necessary. Kofi, although broken internally by public humiliation, refuses to let himself be defined by it. "I have never been what I am because of other people," he once declared in a television interview. "I am what I am in spite of them." These words resonate as a promise not only for himself, but for an entire community. Racism and police brutality will no longer have the last word.